The truck rattled over frozen ground, its canvas cover flapping in the bitter February wind of 1945. Inside, 17 women sat pressed against one another, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. They wore the tattered remains of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. Gray wool coats stained with mud and ash, threadbare skirts that no longer kept out the cold, boots with soles that had separated from their uppers and been tied back with wire and string. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin stretched too thin, eyes hollowed by exhaustion and something deeper than mere fatigue. The heavy knowledge of defeat, of a world turned inside out. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Greta Hoffman sat near the back, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She was 24 but looked older, her blonde hair chopped short and uneven where she'd cut it herself with a pocket knife 3 weeks ago, trying to rid herself of lice. Next to her, Liesl Werner stared at nothing, her lips moving silently in what might have been prayer or might have been the recitation of some internal list. Names of people she'd lost, perhaps, or places that no longer existed. Liesl had been a switchboard operator in Hamburg before the war reached its final, catastrophic stages. Now she was a prisoner, though none of them knew exactly what that meant. The truck lurched to a stop. The canvas flap was pulled aside, and cold light flooded in. Not the gray, smoke-choked light they'd grown accustomed to in the bombed-out cities and makeshift camps of the retreating German forces, but clear, sharp winter sunlight that made them squint. An American soldier stood there, young and clean-shaven, his uniform immaculate in a way that seemed impossible. He didn't point his rifle at them. He simply gestured for them to climb down. Rouse, one of the women muttered automatically, out, but then caught herself. They weren't giving orders anymore. They were receiving them. They climbed down one by one, their legs stiff from the hours of travel, boots crunching on snow that looked impossibly white and untouched. Greta was the last to descend, and as her feet hit the ground, she looked up at the compound before them. It was surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at each corner, but the buildings inside were intact. Wooden structures with actual roofs, windows with glass still in them, smoke rising from chimneys. After months of sleeping in bombed-out cellars and abandoned train stations, the sight was disorienting. "Move along, ladies," the young soldier said in accented but understandable German. His tone wasn't harsh. It was almost polite. That, more than anything, set Greta's teeth on edge. Politeness suggested they were people, and people could be hurt in ways that mere prisoners couldn't. They were led through gates that swung open smoothly, no rust, no broken hinges, and into a processing area. Here, more American soldiers waited, along with 2 women in Red Cross uniforms who spoke German fluently. The Germans stood in a ragged line, waiting for whatever came next. Interrogation, perhaps, or medical examinations designed to catalog their usefulness or lack thereof. Greta had heard stories of what happened to prisoners, though she'd also heard that the Americans were different from the Russians. She didn't know what to believe anymore. One of the Red Cross women stepped forward. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and gray persistent cough that rattled in her chest. But medical attention from the enemy? What with streaks in her brown hair? "My name is Margaret," she said in German. "We're going to get you processed, cleaned up, and fed. You'll be assigned barracks and given clean clothing. Does anyone require immediate medical attention?" The women looked at one another. Several had injuries. Liesl had a poorly healed burn on her forearm from a cooking fire, and Anna Brecht, who'd been a secretary in the Luftwaffe, had that cost them? "It's not a trick," Margaret said gently, as if reading their thoughts. "You're prisoners of war, yes, but you're also human beings. We'll treat you as such." Greta felt something twist in her chest. Not quite hope, because hope was dangerous, but something adjacent to it. A tiny, treacherous whisper that said perhaps survival might include dignity. They were led to a bathing facility first. Inside, steam rose from actual hot water flowing from pipes in the ceiling. The women undressed slowly, shyly, even though they'd lived in close quarters for months. There was something about stripping down in front of the enemy that felt different from stripping down in front of one another. but the hot water, when it came, was undeniable. Greta stood under the stream and felt tears mixing with the water on her face. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been truly warm. Soap was provided, real soap that smelled of lavender, not the harsh lye cakes they'd made do with. Towels were thick and clean. When they emerged, they were given undergarments, wool pants, cotton shirts, and sweaters. All American military surplus, all clean, all whole. Greta ran her fingers over the fabric of her new shirt, marveling at the evenness of the weave, the absence of holes or patches. "This way, please," Margaret said, leading them to another building. It was a mess hall, they realized, with long tables and benches. The smell hit them before they entered. Coffee, something sweet and yeasty, the rich aroma of cooking meat. Greta's stomach clenched so hard it hurt. They'd been living on watery soup and stale bread for so long that the smell alone was overwhelming. But what waited inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. At one end of the room, several American soldiers stood behind a serving line. On the tables before them were trays of food, not scraps, not rations measured out to the gram, but abundance. There were scrambled eggs, yellow and fluffy. There were sausages, glistening with fat. There were potatoes fried until golden. And there, in the center of it all, were things none of them had seen in years. Donuts, glazed and perfect, stacked on white plates. Next to them, a large urn steamed, and the smell coming from it was unmistakable. Hot chocolate, rich and sweet. The women stopped at the entrance, frozen. It had to be a trap. Food like this didn't exist anymore, not in their world. It was propaganda, perhaps, or a test: eat and be poisoned, or eat and owe something terrible in return. "Please," Margaret said, gesturing to the serving line. "Take what you want. There's plenty." Still, no one moved. Greta stared at the donuts. She'd had one once, before the war, at a cafe in Berlin where her father had taken her for her 15th birthday. The memory was so distant it felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Finally, Liesel took a tentative step forward. Then another. The others followed slowly, as if approaching something sacred or forbidden. They picked up metal trays from a stack. Real trays, not broken or bent, and moved down the line. The American soldier serving the eggs smiled at them. "How many?" he asked in broken German, holding up a serving spoon. When Greta hesitated, he simply heaped a generous portion onto her tray. Then sausages. Then potatoes. When she reached the donuts, she looked up at the young man serving them. He couldn't have been more than 19, with freckles and red hair. "Take two," he said in English, and though she didn't understand the words, his gesture was clear. She took one donut with trembling hands, placing it on her tray as if it might shatter. He grinned and added a second. At the end of the line, another soldier ladled hot chocolate into thick ceramic mugs. The steam rose, carrying with it a smell so rich and sweet that Greta felt dizzy. She carried her tray to one of the tables and sat down, the others joining her in silence. For a long moment, none of them ate. They simply stared at the food before them, unable to reconcile its existence with everything they knew about the world. War meant hunger. Defeat meant starvation. Prisoners ate scraps, if they ate at all. But this, Liesel was the first to lift her fork. She took a small bite of scrambled eggs, chewed slowly, and then her face crumpled. She began to cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent tears that streamed down her cheeks as she continued to eat. The sight broke something in the others, and suddenly they were all eating, some weeping, some laughing in disbelief, some simply silent and focused on the impossible task of consuming food that tasted like something other than survival. Greta picked up the donut with both hands. The glaze was sticky on her fingers, sweet and real. She bit into it, and the texture was soft, yielding, nothing like the hard bread they choked down for months. The sweetness exploded on her tongue. Sugar, real sugar, not the bitter ersatz they'd grown accustomed to. She closed her eyes and chewed slowly, trying to make it last, trying to memorize this moment before it vanished like a dream. Then she reached for the mug of hot chocolate. It was still hot enough to burn slightly, and she sipped carefully. The chocolate was rich and creamy, sweet but not cloying. with a depth of flavor she'd forgotten existed. She took another sip, then another, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and down into her stomach, thawing something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it could melt. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Anna Brecht held her mug with both hands and breathed in the steam as if it were medicine. Margaret Schultz, who'd been an accountant in Munich and prided herself on maintaining composure, bit into a donut and then laughed. Actually laughed. A sound so unexpected that several women looked up in alarm before they realized it was joy, not hysteria. Greta looked across the room and saw Margaret watching them. Her kind eyes glistening with tears she didn't bother to hide. Next to her, an American officer stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He was older than the enlisted men, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of things seen and decisions made. He caught Greta looking and held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Sadness. Not pity. Pity would have been easier to bear, but a deep, weary sadness that matched her own. The barracks they were assigned to were simple but clean. Wooden bunks with real mattresses, thin but intact, and wool blankets that smelled of cedar from storage. There were 16 bunks in total, more than enough for their group. Windows let in natural light, and a wood stove in the center promised warmth. After so many nights sleeping on cold floors or huddled in ruins, the space felt impossibly luxurious. Greta claimed a lower bunk near the back. Not because she had any preference, but because it was farthest from the door, old instincts from months of bombing raids, where being near an exit could mean getting crushed in a panic. She sat on the edge of the mattress and tested it gently with her hands. It compressed under the pressure and sprang back. A real mattress with actual stuffing. Liesel took the bunk above hers. "I keep thinking I'll wake up," she said softly. "And this will all be gone. We'll be back in that cellar in Dresden, and the sirens will be going off again." Greta understood. Dresden was where they'd both been captured, or rather, where they'd surrendered. The city had been an inferno, and when the American troops had arrived in the aftermath, pushing east while the Russians came west, she and Liesel had stumbled out of the ruins with their hands raised, too exhausted to run, too hungry to care what came next. That had been 3 weeks ago, though it felt like years. "It's real," Greta said, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. "The food was real. I can still taste it." And she could. The sweetness of the donut lingered on her tongue. A ghost of pleasure that seemed obscene in a world that had forgotten such things. She'd eaten both donuts slowly, savoring every bite, and then she'd gone back to the serving line with her empty tray, expecting to be turned away. Instead, the red-haired soldier had smiled and given her 2 more. "Take them to your bunk," Margaret had suggested. "You'll want something for later." Greta had wrapped them carefully in a paper napkin and tucked them into the pocket of her new pants. They were there now, pressing gently against her hip like a promise. Over the next few days, they began to understand the rhythm of the camp. Reveille was at 7, but no one burst into the barracks shouting or dragging them from bed. Instead, a bell rang, a clear, almost cheerful sound, and they were expected to dress and report to the mess hall for breakfast. The first morning, they'd rushed, pulling on clothes and lacing boots in a panic, but when they arrived breathless at the mess hall, they found the serving line calm and orderly, the same young soldiers smiling and ladling out oatmeal, eggs, and, incredibly, more donuts. "Do they just have an endless supply?" Anna whispered, staring at the tray of glazed rings. "The Americans," Margaret said with a hint of her old accountant's practicality returning, "are very, very rich. We knew this in theory, but I don't think we understood what it meant." After breakfast, there were tasks. Not hard labor, but chores to maintain the camp. Some women were assigned to laundry, others to cleaning duties, others to helping in the kitchen. Greta found herself part of a group that swept and mopped the main administrative building. The work was easy, almost meditative, and the American soldiers who worked in the offices nodded politely when they passed, sometimes offering words in broken German. "Guten Morgen. Danke." It was during one of these cleaning shifts that Greta first spoke at length with Margaret. The Red Cross worker was organizing files in one of the offices, and Greta was mopping the hallway outside. Margaret emerged with a stack of folders and paused when she saw Greta working. "You're very thorough," Margaret said in German. Greta shrugged. "My mother taught me to clean properly. She said half-done work was worse than no work at all." "Your mother is a wise woman. Is she?" Margaret let the question trail off delicately. "I don't know," Greta said, wringing out her mop in the bucket. "I haven't heard from her since October. She was in Berlin. After the last big raids." She didn't finish. There was no need. Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. This war has taken too much from too many." "You say that as if you weren't on the winning side," Greta said, then immediately regretted her tone. But Margaret didn't flinch. "Winning and losing," Margaret said quietly, "matter less than you'd think when you're standing in the ruins counting the dead. I was in France last year helping civilians after the liberation. Do you know what I saw? Starving children. Women who'd lost everything. Men who'd collaborated. Men who'd resisted. All of them broken in different ways. War doesn't have a winning side, not really. It just has an ending side and a continuing side, and right now you're on the ending side. That might be the closest thing to winning anyone gets." Greta absorbed this, leaning on her mop. "Why are you being kind to us? We were your enemies. Some of the women here," she lowered her voice, "worked in offices that sent pilots to bomb your cities. Anna typed up requisition orders for aircraft parts. Liesel connected calls between commanders planning attacks. I myself worked in a supply depot routing materials to the front. We weren't innocent civilians. We were part of it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know what my job is? Really? It's not just to process prisoners or hand out blankets. It's to remember that every person is still a person, no matter what uniform they wore or what desk they sat behind. You're asking me why we're kind? Because cruelty is easy. It takes no effort at all to be cruel to someone you've defeated. Kindness is what requires courage. Kindness is what proves we're different from the people who started this war." Greta felt something in her chest crack. Not break, but shift, like ice beginning to thaw. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and went back to mopping. That evening, there was hot chocolate again in the mess hall. It had become a routine. Every evening after dinner, the urn was brought out, and the women could have as much as they wanted. Some of them still approached it with disbelief, taking small, careful portions as if expecting the supply to run out. But others, growing bolder, filled their mugs to the brim and went back for seconds. Greta sat with Liesel and Anna, sipping her chocolate slowly. At the next table, a group of younger women were talking in low voices: Else, Frida, Hannah, and Bridget, all in their early 20s, all former clerks and secretaries in various branches of the Wehrmacht. They'd formed a tight group, defensive and wary, speaking only to each other. "They don't trust it," Liesel observed, watching them. "They think it's a trick, that we're being fattened up for something worse." "Are we?" Anna asked, and her voice was carefully neutral. Greta had wondered the same thing. The kindness felt real, but she'd been fooled before. During the last year of the war, there had been promises. Food that never came, safety in cities that were bombed the next day, victory that turned to ash in their mouths. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But then she thought of the red-haired soldier who'd given her extra donuts. The way Margaret's eyes had glistened watching them eat. The American officer's sadness. Those things were harder to fake than cruelty. "I don't know," Greta said finally. "But right now we're warm, we're fed, and no one is hurting us. That's more than we had a month ago. I'll take it." The weeks began to pass. February gave way to March, and the snow started to melt, revealing muddy ground beneath. The daily routine became familiar: wake, eat, work, eat, work, eat, sleep. The food remained abundant. Not just donuts and hot chocolate, though those appeared regularly, but also soups thick with vegetables, bread that was fresh and soft, meat that didn't come from tins, fruit that tasted like something other than preservatives. Greta began to gain weight, just a little, enough that her face didn't look quite so gaunt in the small mirror hung in the barracks washroom. Liesel's cough faded with rest and regular meals. Anna's burn healed under the care of the camp medic, an American doctor who treated her with the same gentle efficiency he'd use on his own soldiers. But it wasn't just the physical healing that was happening. Something subtler was shifting in the barracks, in the way the women spoke to each other and moved through the camp. The defensive hunching of shoulders began to ease. Conversations grew longer, ventured beyond mere survival into memories of before. Stories of childhood, of peacetime pleasures, of people they'd loved. One evening, Margaret produced a deck of cards from somewhere, donated by one of the American soldiers, she said, and taught the others a game her grandmother had played. They sat around the wood stove in the barracks, playing for matchsticks, and for an hour or two they could almost forget where they were. Almost, because at night the dreams came. Greta dreamed of Berlin burning, of her mother's face in the smoke, calling her name. She dreamed of the supply depot where she'd worked, the endless lists of materials she'd checked and rechecked, knowing they were going to the front, knowing they were keeping the war machine moving. She told herself she was just doing her job, following orders. But in the dreams, those justifications dissolved like sugar in hot water, leaving only the bitter sediment of complicity. She woke one night gasping, her heart hammering, and found Liesel already awake in the bunk above, staring at the ceiling. "I can't stop seeing Dresden," Liesel whispered. "The fires, the screaming. We ran through streets I'd walked my whole life, and they were just gone, melted. And I keep thinking we did that to other cities first, didn't we? To London, to Rotterdam. This was just it coming back to us." Greta climbed out of her bunk and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. After a moment, Liesel climbed down and joined her. They sat in silence, shoulders touching, sharing the weight of understanding. "Do you think they hate us?" Liesel asked eventually. "The Americans. They're kind. But do you think underneath they hate us for what Germany did?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Greta thought of Margaret's words about remembering that every person is still a person. She thought of the young soldiers who smiled when they served food, who said Guten Morgen in their American accents, who treated them like people. "I think," Greta said slowly, "they probably hate what was done. How could they not? But I don't think they hate us. Not individually. Or maybe they've decided that hating us wouldn't change anything. So they choose something else instead. Is that even possible?" Liesel's voice was small, childlike. "To separate what a country does from the people in it? I don't know," Greta admitted. "But they're trying. Maybe that's what matters." The next morning, there was a new addition to breakfast. Fresh strawberries, impossibly red and sweet, shipped from somewhere warm. The women stared at them like they were jewels, and when Greta bit into one, the burst of flavor on her tongue was so intense, so vivid, that she felt tears prick her eyes. She was crying over a strawberry, over kindness, over the impossible fact of surviving into a world that still contained such things. Across the mess hall, Margaret watched and smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but a sad, understanding one that said, yes, this is what healing looks like. It hurts just as much as breaking did, but in a different way. It was late March when the newspapers arrived. They came in bundles, American and British publications that were distributed to the common areas of the camp, the mess hall, the recreation room where the prisoners were allowed to spend evening hours, the small library that had been set up with donated books. At first, the women ignored them. English was a foreign language to most, and besides, what could American newspapers tell them that they didn't already know? The war was over, Germany had lost. Their world was ashes. What more was there to learn? But Greta, who'd studied English in school before the war made such things impossible, picked up a copy of Stars and Stripes one evening. The headline was in large, bold letters, "Concentration Camp Liberated. Atrocities Revealed." Below it was a photograph that made her stomach turn. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, living skeletons staring at the camera with eyes that had seen hell. The caption read, "Survivors of Bergen-Belsen greet British liberators." She stared at the photograph for a long time, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She'd heard rumors, of course, whispers about camps in the East, about Jews being relocated, about harsh measures against enemies of the state. But this looked like something from a nightmare, not from the real world, not from Germany. She began to read the article, her English rusty but sufficient. The words were clinical, factual, describing conditions that seemed impossible. Mass graves, gas chambers, systematic murder on a scale beyond comprehension. She read about Auschwitz, about Dachau, about names she'd never heard and places she'd thought were just labor camps, places where people worked for the war effort like she had worked in her supply depot. But this was different. This wasn't work. This was extermination. "What are you reading?" Liesel asked, coming to sit beside her. Greta couldn't answer. She just turned the newspaper so Liesel could see the photograph. Liesel's face went white, then gray. She read in silence, her lips moving slightly, and then she stood up abruptly and walked away, her hand over her mouth. But Greta kept reading. She read the next issue and the next. More photographs appeared. American soldiers forcing German civilians to tour the camps, to see what had been done in their name. Men in suits and women in dresses walking through rooms stacked with corpses, their faces twisted in horror or disgust or denial. The article said that many claimed not to have known, that they'd lived near these places and smelled nothing, heard nothing, saw nothing. Had she known? The question became a weight in Greta's chest, pressing down every time she breathed. She thought of the propaganda, the speeches about racial purity and the Jewish threat, the gradual disappearance of neighbors and co-workers. She thought of how she'd accepted it all, not actively supported it, perhaps, but accepted it. Looked away. Told herself it wasn't her concern, that she was just a clerk in a supply depot, that politics were for other people to worry about. And now here were the consequences, staring out at her from grainy newsprint, undeniable and monstrous. One evening, Margaret found Greta in the recreation room, surrounded by newspapers, her face streaked with tears she hadn't noticed were falling. "You're reading about the camps," Margaret said softly, sitting down across from her. It wasn't a question. "Did you know?" Greta asked, her voice hoarse. "Did you know about this before? Before you came here? Before you saw us?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Some of it. Not the full extent. I don't think anyone outside the camps knew the full extent until they were liberated. But yes, we knew. There were reports, witness testimonies, intelligence. We knew something monstrous was happening. Then why?" Greta gestured at the mess hall beyond, at the barracks, at everything that had confused and comforted her in equal measure. "Why feed us donuts and hot chocolate? Why treat us like we matter? We're part of the country that did this. Her voice broke. "We let this happen." Margaret was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Greta? I see a young woman who was born into a country that went mad. I see someone who made choices within a system that limited those choices to terrible or more terrible. I see someone who is capable of understanding, of grief, of change. And I see someone who is asking the right questions, which is more than many do." "That's not enough," Greta said bitterly. "Being sorry isn't enough. Understanding isn't enough. Those people—" She touched the photograph of the survivors. Their skeletal forms burned into her mind. "They're dead or destroyed, and being sorry doesn't bring them back." "No," Margaret agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing does. But what's the alternative? Should we starve you because others were starved? Should we brutalize you because others were brutalized? Would that bring anyone back? Would that make the world better?" Greta had no answer. She just stared at the newspapers, at the evidence of her country's sins, and felt the donuts she'd eaten that evening turn to lead in her stomach. The newspapers spread through the camp like a virus, or perhaps like a vaccine, painful but necessary. The women read them in clusters, some denying, some weeping, some falling into stunned silence. Else and her group of younger women refused to believe it at first, calling it propaganda, allied lies designed to make them feel guilty. But more newspapers came, and with them more photographs, more testimonies, more evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The atmosphere in the barracks changed. Conversations that had begun to lighten became heavy again, but with a different kind of weight. They weren't discussing survival anymore. They were discussing culpability, complicity, the unbearable question of what they'd been part of. One night, Anna broke down completely. She sat on her bunk, clutching a newspaper article about Dachau, and sobbed so hard she couldn't breathe. "I typed the orders," she kept saying. "I typed orders for supply trains. What if some of those trains went to the camps? What if I helped send people to their deaths by doing my job efficiently?" Margaret, always the practical one, tried to comfort her. "You couldn't have known. None of us could have known the full extent. But we knew something," Anna shouted, her voice ragged. "We knew Jews were disappearing. We knew communists were being arrested. We knew people whispered about camps. We knew, and we told ourselves it wasn't our business, that we were just doing our jobs, that it was better not to ask questions. We knew enough to be guilty." The silence that followed was suffocating. Because she was right. They had known enough. Maybe not the full horror, maybe not the systematic nature of it, but enough to understand that something evil was happening. And they'd chosen comfort over courage, safety over questions. Greta thought of her mother, wondered if she was alive, wondered if she'd known, wondered if she'd cared. She thought of her father, dead since 1943 in Russia, wondered what he'd seen, what he'd done, whether he'd been a good man in an evil system or whether he'd embraced the evil. She'd never know now. The war had taken him before she could ask the questions that mattered. The kindness of their captors became, in a strange way, harder to bear. Every donut felt like an accusation, every cup of hot chocolate a reminder that they were being treated better than their country had treated its victims. Some women stopped eating the sweets altogether, subsisting on bread and soup as if self-imposed deprivation could balance some cosmic scale. But Greta found herself doing the opposite. She ate the donuts. She drank the hot chocolate. She accepted the kindness even as it scalded her conscience. Because Margaret was right, refusing it wouldn't change anything. The dead would stay dead. The atrocities would remain atrocious. All she could do was bear witness, accept the guilt, and try to understand how a country of ordinary people, people like her, had allowed the extraordinary evil to happen. One afternoon, the American officer who'd watched them that first day, the one with gray at his temples and sad eyes, came to address them in the mess hall. His name, they'd learned, was Colonel Matthews. He spoke through an interpreter, a German-American sergeant who translated his words precisely. "Ladies," Colonel Matthews began, "by now you've all seen the newspapers. You know what's been discovered in the camps across Germany and Poland. I want to tell you something important. You are not responsible for those atrocities. You didn't run the camps. You didn't build the gas chambers. But you are responsible for understanding what your country did, for carrying that knowledge forward, and for making sure, absolutely sure, that it never happens again. That's your burden now. Not guilt for things you didn't personally do, but responsibility for remembering, for telling the truth, for being better." He paused, and his eyes swept across them, not unkindly but not gently either. "We're treating you well here not because you deserve it more than anyone else, but because we believe that civilization means treating everyone with basic human dignity, even former enemies. Especially former enemies. If we became cruel just because we had the power to be cruel, we'd be no better than the system we just defeated. Do you understand?" There were slow nods around the room. Greta understood. It was a lesson in what humanity could be, not what it had been, not what it might become in anger, but what it should be as a matter of principle. "There will be trials," Colonel Matthews continued. "The people responsible for the camps, for war crimes, they'll face justice. But you," he gestured to include all of them, "you're POWs who did your jobs in a system that was rotten from the top. When this war ends officially, when the paperwork is done, you'll go home. And when you do, you'll carry this knowledge with you. You'll tell people what happened. You'll make sure the truth isn't buried or forgotten. That's how you pay the debt that can't really be paid. That's how you honor the dead. By remembering them, by speaking their names, by making sure the word never has weight behind it when you say never again." After he left, the mess hall remained silent for a long time. Then, slowly, women began to eat again, to drink their hot chocolate, to accept the kindness that came with strings attached, invisible but unbreakable strings of moral responsibility. That night, Greta wrote a letter to her mother, not knowing if it would ever be delivered, not even knowing if her mother was alive to read it. In it, she wrote about the newspapers, about the photographs, about the weight of understanding. She wrote, "I don't know if you knew. I don't know if I knew. But we should have known better, asked more, looked harder. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what we let happen by not being brave enough to stop it." She sealed the letter and gave it to Margaret, who promised to try to get it through the Red Cross system, to track down Greta's mother if she still lived. It was a small thing, an insufficient thing, but it was something. And that night, when Greta drank her cup of hot chocolate, she let herself taste every bit of its sweetness, knowing it was both a gift and a reminder. A reminder that kindness existed, that humanity could choose compassion over cruelty, that even in the ruins of everything they'd known, something better might be built. The question was whether she could live up to that possibility. Spring came fully in April, transforming the camp from a stark winter landscape into something almost green. The women were allowed outside more, permitted to walk the perimeter within the fenced areas, to feel sun on their faces and seagrass beginning to push through the mud. It was during these walks that Greta began to talk more with the other prisoners, moving beyond her small circle of Liesel and Anna to engage with the younger women, with Margaret and her practical wisdom, with all the fractured souls trying to piece themselves back together. Else, the youngest of them at 19, finally approached Greta one afternoon as they walked the fence line. She'd been one of the most resistant, one of the most vocal in calling the newspaper reports propaganda. But something had shifted in her face. The defiance had cracked, revealing raw confusion underneath. "I need to ask you something," Else said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were relatively alone. "You read English better than most of us. Have there been any reports that say the photographs were staged? That maybe some of it was exaggerated?" Greta stopped walking and looked at the younger woman. She saw herself at 19, so certain of things, so sure that the world made sense if you just followed the rules and trusted the authorities. She wanted to lie, to give Else the comfort of doubt. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "You're responsible for remembering, for telling the truth." "No," Greta said simply. "If anything, the reports suggest the reality was worse than the photographs can convey. Else, I know it's hard to accept. I'm struggling with it too. But denying it doesn't make it less true. It just makes us complicit in burying it." Elsa's eyes filled with tears. "My brother was SS," she whispered. "He wrote letters home about maintaining order, about relocating populations. He made it sound administrative, boring even. What if he knew? What if he did things?" Greta had no answer that would comfort. "I don't know what your brother did, but you're not him. You can't carry his sins, only your own. And maybe the sin we all share is that we didn't ask enough questions when we still could have." They walked in silence for a while longer. Then Else said, "The hot chocolate tastes different now. Not bad, just heavy. Like I can feel its weight." "I know," Greta said. "I feel it too." But they still drank it. Every evening, when the urn was brought out, they still filled their cups. Because denying themselves wouldn't change the past, and because there was something important in accepting kindness even when you felt unworthy of it. Perhaps especially then. It was a lesson in grace that none of them had expected to learn from their captors. In May, the war in Europe officially ended. The news came through the camp like a strange, muted thing. No celebrations among the prisoners, just a quiet acknowledgement that the machine had finally ground to a halt. Victory Day for the Allies meant something different for them. The end of one uncertainty and the beginning of another. What would happen to them now? Would they be sent home? And what exactly was home anymore? Colonel Matthews addressed them again, this time with better news. "Processing for repatriation will begin in 2 weeks, he said through his interpreter. "You'll be evaluated, cleared, and sent back to your homes, or to wherever you have family. The Red Cross will help you make contact with relatives and find places to stay if your homes were destroyed." Homes destroyed. Such a clean phrase for what they'd all been avoiding thinking about. Greta's apartment in Berlin was almost certainly rubble. Liesel's family house in Hamburg had been in the city center. She'd already accepted it was gone. Anna didn't even know which occupation zone her hometown would fall into, American, British, French, or Soviet. The last option terrified her most. "I don't want to go back," Liesel said that night in the barracks. "Is that terrible? To not want to go home?" "Home to what?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. "Everything we knew is gone. We'll be going back to a country that doesn't exist anymore, to cities that are rubble, to people who either died or wish they had. And we'll be carrying this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the weight of knowledge, the burden of the newspapers, the camps, the guilt. "How do we go back carrying this?" "The same way we got up this morning," Greta said quietly. "One step at a time. One day at a time. We don't have a choice, so we make the best of no choices." Anna, who'd been crying daily since the newspapers arrived, spoke up. "I want to help somehow. I don't know how, but I want to do something that matters. I spent the war typing orders that might have helped kill people. I want to spend the peace doing something else. Something better." "Like what?" Elsa asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know yet," Anna admitted. "But maybe that's what I need to figure out. Maybe that's what we all need to figure out. How to be useful in building something instead of maintaining something terrible." The conversation marked a turning point. Over the following days, the women began to talk not just about the past or the immediate present, but about the future. What would Germany look like? What role would they play in it? How did you rebuild not just buildings but trust, decency, the basic framework of civilization that had been so thoroughly shattered? One evening, Margaret joined them in the barracks, bringing with her a box of supplies, paper, pencils, a few books. "I thought you might want to start preparing," she said. "You'll need documentation for repatriation, but also, some of you might want to write things down. Your experiences, your thoughts. The Americans are already starting to document what happened, but your perspectives matter too. Not as excuses, but as testimony, as witness." Greta took a pencil and paper, feeling the weight of it. What would she write? How did you capture the complexity of being both victim and perpetrator, of suffering in a war your country started, of receiving kindness you weren't sure you deserved? She began simply. "My name is Greta Hoffman. I am 24 years old. I was born in Berlin in 1921, in the chaos after the First War, in a country that never quite found its footing again. I grew up believing certain things about duty, about nation, about following orders. I am writing this because I need to remember that I believe those things, and I need to understand how I could have believed them, so I never believe anything so blindly again." Around her, other women were beginning to write too, or draw, or simply sit with the blank paper in front of them, contemplating what could possibly be said. The scratching of pencils on paper became a quiet chorus, a different kind of testimony than the ones being given at the war crimes tribunals, but testimony nonetheless. That night there was hot chocolate again. But this time, when Greta filled her cup, she paused at the serving station and looked at the young red-haired soldier who'd been there since the beginning, who'd given her extra donuts that first impossible day. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "Thank you for kindness." His freckled face broke into a genuine smile. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said. Then, in hesitant German, "Es wird besser." It will get better. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that anything could get better after what they'd learned, after what they'd been part of. But as she carried her hot chocolate back to her table, as she sat with Liesel and Anna and the others, as she felt the warmth seep into her hands, she thought maybe there was a kind of better that wasn't about forgetting or erasing, but about carrying forward. About being changed by what you'd learned and letting that change make you someone who could help prevent it from happening again. "I think," she said slowly, speaking to the table but really to herself, "we need to remember this." "The camps?" Liesel asked. "Everything," Greta said. "The camps, yes. What was done and what we didn't stop. But also this," she raised her cup of hot chocolate. "The fact that people we'd been taught to hate chose kindness instead. The fact that when they had power over us, they used it to give us donuts and hot baths and dignity. We need to remember both things. The worst we're capable of and the best. Otherwise, we'll only remember the horror, and that will break us. Or we'll only remember the justifications, and that will doom us to repeat everything." It was perhaps the most important thing she'd said since arriving at the camp, and in the silence that followed, she saw understanding dawn on the faces around her. They couldn't change the past. They couldn't bring back the dead or undo the evil. But they could carry forward a full accounting, the darkness and the light, the guilt and the grace, and let both shape who they became. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of processing, of paperwork filled out in triplicate, of medical examinations and interviews with officials trying to determine their exact roles in the war, their political affiliations, whether they posed any threat or had committed any crimes beyond existing in a country gone mad. None of them were found guilty of anything specific. They were auxiliary personnel, clerks, operators, women who'd done their jobs without authority or power beyond the narrow scope of their duties. But they were also being released into a Germany that would need to reckon with itself, and they would be part of that reckoning whether they wanted to be or not. On the final evening before the first group was scheduled to leave, Colonel Matthews arranged something special. Instead of the usual mess hall dinner, tables were set up outside, between the barracks, in the spring evening air. There were lanterns hung from poles, and the food was plentiful. Not just army rations, but food the camp cooks had prepared with care. There were vegetables from somewhere, fresh bread, even a cake that someone had managed to bake. And there were donuts, mountains of them, more than they'd seen even on that first overwhelming day. And hot chocolate flowing freely, cups refilled as many times as anyone wanted. "It's a farewell," Margaret explained to Greta as they stood watching the preparations. "A way to send you off with something good to remember. Tomorrow you go back to a hard world. Tonight, we wanted to give you one more evening of not being quite so hard." Greta felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for all of this, for treating us like we mattered when we weren't sure we did." Margaret turned to her, and her kind eyes were serious. "You matter, Greta. You all matter. Not because of anything you did or didn't do in the war, but because you're human, and that's enough. That has to be enough, or we've learned nothing from any of this. Do you understand?" Greta nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she did understand. Not fully. But maybe understanding was something that would come later, after years of living with what she'd learned, after time to process and integrate and figure out how to be a person in a world that had shown her both its worst and, surprisingly, its best. The dinner was beautiful. They ate until they were full, genuinely full. Not the false fullness of hunger temporarily quieted, but the real satisfaction of abundance. They drank hot chocolate until their stomachs couldn't hold anymore, and they laughed. Actually laughed. At jokes and stories, at the absurdity of their situation, at the strange grace of being here, alive, fed, safe, when months ago survival had seemed impossible. As the evening drew to a close and the stars began to appear overhead, Greta found herself standing near the fence, looking out at the darkening world beyond. Liesel joined her, and then Anna, and then others, until a small group of them stood together, silent, contemplating what came next. "I'm afraid," Else said softly. "I'm afraid to go back. I'm afraid of what we'll find. I'm afraid of who I'll have to become to survive it." "Then we'll be afraid together," Greta said. "And maybe that's how we survive. By carrying each other. By remembering that we're not alone in this. By telling the truth about what happened even when it's hard." They stood together as the night deepened, as the lanterns flickered behind them, as the taste of chocolate lingered on their tongues, sweet and rich and impossible. A gift from enemies who'd chosen to be something better. A reminder that even in the ruins of everything, kindness could still exist. And in that moment, Greta made a promise to herself. She would remember. She would remember the camps and the horror. She would remember her complicity and the complicity of millions like her who'd chosen not to see, not to ask, not to resist. But she would also remember this, the donuts, the hot chocolate, the unexpected grace of being treated like a human when she'd feared being treated like the enemy she was. She would carry it all forward. The guilt and the grace, the shame and the gift, and somehow, impossibly, she would try to be better than she'd been. To build something from the ruins that might honor both the dead she'd failed to save and the living who'd shown her what mercy looked like. Tomorrow they would leave. Tomorrow they would face the rubble of their country and their lives. But tonight, they had full stomachs and warm drinks and the knowledge that they'd survived to see kindness when they'd expected only justice. It would have to be enough. it would have to be the beginning. Subscribe to The Last Witnesses, where silence is never forgotten.